The following is an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
Welcome to Island Justice with Roger Batchelor. Today we're going to be talking about the regulation and deregulation of marijuana and its impact on the justice system. And today I've got with me Don Mckay from Don McKay Law Corporation and Ted Smith from International Hempology 101 Society. Did I get that right? Okay, good. And I thought the first question I would ask is actually for Ted. And Ted, I know that International Hempology 101 has an interesting title to it, and it sounds like from some of the things you've said to me earlier that you actually really practice that. I understand you've got a lecture series at UVic. Could you tell us about that?
Certainly. One of the first things I did coming up 16 years ago was start a Hempology 101 club at the University of Victoria. It's now the largest student club on campus, and we're coming into our 6th year where I've taught a free lecture series. Again, in September is the first semester, and there's 22 different classes that cover a broad range of subjects from ancient history to hemp to medical marijuana. It probably is the primary focus of most of the lectures, but we do one on law, one on politics, and one on growing, and really cover the full spectrum of issues that the plant touches. Mm-hmm. And we have a weekly 420 meeting after the lecture out in the middle of the campus. We have a convention once a year, movie nights and other events as well. But the terms of the sign-up of the students, we get well over 420 students a year and are otherwise a very popular club.
Interesting. Now, in terms of growing, Don, what happens if you do grow marijuana and the criminal justice system gets involved?
Well, quite a bit happens. First of all, if you're suspected of growing marijuana, the police will usually involve Hydro in trying to conduct an investigation of your power usage. Following that, when they believe they have the basis to do so, they'll obtain a search warrant, go into the house. You'll be arrested. You'll be held in custody while they clear the house of the grow operation or the farm or outbuilding, whatever the location happens to be. You'll end up having to pay for damage to the house with regards to Hydro suing you, or at least making a claim for the power loss and the restoration of power if there's been a bypass put in, their time of their service people to fix everything. Most of the time, people who are arrested for cultivation don't get held in custody. They get released on a promise to appear in court. But then you'll have to appear in court. You'll be charged with an indictable offense. You'll end up having to, in theory, hire a lawyer. It's always a good practice to do so. You'll have to go through court. You get to choose whether you plead guilty or not guilty. If you plead not guilty, you'll have to have a trial. And that's a very expensive proposition.
Mm-hmm. And what are the range of consequences if you end up being found guilty?
There's substantial consequences that come out of this, not the least of which is the presumption that for cultivation you'll serve a jail sentence. You might not actually serve that sentence in jail. We have conditional sentences which are often handed out in these types of cases. But there's a huge financial impact. If you're owning the property could be seized as proceeds of crime. Certainly the fines are substantial in terms of that. If you're believed to be making money off of the sale, Revenue Canada will get involved, and they'll look at your assets and see whether or not you have undeclared income. People have been estimated at making hundreds of thousands of dollars off of this and had to pay hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines. So it's really a substantial impact.
So Ted, given all that, why would anybody want to grow medical marijuana?
Well, there's a lot of reasons why people would grow cannabis in general, but when it comes to medical marijuana in particular, there are a wide range of symptoms that can be greatly benefited through the use of this plant that pharmaceutical drugs don't have the same effect upon or as much benefit for. And more people every day are discovering that using cannabis in small amounts can alleviate a wide range of symptoms when eaten. In particular, cannabis is anti-inflammatory, it's antibiotic, antiseptic, antifungal, antioxidant, it's a muscle relaxant, and a painkiller. And so when you eat a cookie, for example, if you've got a problem like irritable bowel syndrome, well, that's like an inflammation of the gastrointestinal system. Actually, a lot of problems are inflammation related. And being an anti-inflammatory, cannabis is incredibly good at relieving inflammation in your liver. If you have hepatitis C, your liver's swollen, or like I say, your gastrointestinal system, your brain, there's head injuries, people with epilepsy, glaucoma even, it's swelling that will cause various problems. So the relief of inflammation is not as understood or appreciated as it should be. But being an anti-inflammatory, a muscle relaxant, people's stomachs are a smooth muscle. So when you smoke or eat cannabis, it just relaxes that. And other cannabinoids, they're called, the chemicals in the plant, will stimulate your appetite in the brain at the same time. So if you wake up in the morning and you're nauseous from cancer, AIDS, hepatitis C, or even the side effects of the painkillers or whatever else you're taking, the cannabis will will encourage an appetite and help people keep it down. And that is why people are willing to put their lives at risk to grow and to use this plant, and why other people like me are willing to put their lives at risk to make sure that those patients have access to medicine.
So let me get this straight. Under the current scheme that the government has, is there a way that you can grow marijuana legally and use it legally?
There are very limited mechanisms under what the Marijuana Medical Access Regulations, the MMAR, that can allow a person to help as a caregiver. They call it a designated grower. Or if, let's say, Don is a patient, I'm not hoping you ever will be. I personally hope never to be a patient in my own club. But Don, if he applied legally, if his doctor signed the forms, he would be able to grow a certain number of plants. Let's say 5 grams a day would allow him to grow 25 plants. If physically, financially, or just with time, Don couldn't do that, he could sign someone else like me up as what they call a designated grower. I could grow for Don and one other patient, but that's it. The regulations allow for 4 licenses on one property. So in theory, you could have 2 people helping 4 people in one place. But the economies of scale just are not justifiable. For 4 patients to pay for one person's wages and the rent and the facilities for a grow-op is really not functional. So for small-scale grow-ops, people can get a light and put in 6 or 8 plants and stuff. But it's something that when you're really setting up for as many people as come to my door, you need growers that are helping supply 100 people or more, and that way they can do a better job at it. And so I personally and our club really don't sign up to Health Canada's programs. We encourage our members to, so they get legal protection to possess and to grow if they choose. But the restrictions upon growing for a small number of people make it so that if you signed up to the program but really intended upon growing for a compassion club like ours, you would be breaking laws. And so we just don't participate in the program because it's inherently flawed. But a person could grow for 2 people if they so choose. The other option legally is to get it from the government. And there were amendments just recently announced last week to change all that. Well, not all of it, but they want to shut down the ability for a designated grower or an individual to grow their own medicine. At the same time, they want to make some changes for the better, in our opinion, by opening up the field to allow for more choice between the companies and the medicines that they're producing. Right now, the government produces one kind with prairie plant systems, which is just not appropriate. There's many strains of cannabis that have different effects depending on their chemical makeup and essential oils, and that's why they have, there's so many strains that just all will range from what we call sativas, which have a headstone effect and are great painkillers but not much of a muscle relaxant, to other strains that are heavy muscle relaxants. And the difference is quite dramatic, actually, which is why patients need choice. And there may be changes that would make it more accessible, where patients would be able to go to a doctor and get something signed and hopefully in a short time get medicine, as opposed to the months that they're waiting now.
So Don, the kind of clients that you've seen who've been charged with production, I mean, what do they look like? What does the typical client look like? Are they hardcore criminals, or are they other kinds of people?
I would say not hardcore criminals by any stretch. In many cases, it's a desperate family looking to try and either make some ends meet, or I know of one family where there's cancer in the family, and they decided to start a grow operation just to supply their family and friends, because the process was just so incomprehensible to them. There's always going to be organized groups as well that are going to be participating, but even there, you're not dealing with somebody that you would recognize or sort of point your finger at and say, that looks like a bad person to me. It's often it's a neighbor, somebody that you wouldn't necessarily expect or suspect.
And how does the Crown deal with these people? I mean, when you're talking about the average person on the street, you're not talking about...
Well, that's one of the reasons why a lot of folks that are charged with cultivation, as I said, end up getting released. They're not people with a criminal history. They're not people that are generally considered risks to society in terms of being out there. They're people that have, for whatever reason, be it belief, compassion, or economics, have decided to take that step and grow marijuana. In many cases, it's thought of as being the sort of the least harmful alternative. Given that the government has all but decriminalized possession now, the federal government doesn't, at least in BC, approve charges for simple possession. They'll only charge for trafficking or cultivation. The thought in many people's minds is that it's a least harmful alternative. I had a client at one point who was charged with trafficking, and her explanation to the court pleading guilty was, I was hungry, I needed food, I was here, I didn't have a job, and it seemed the least harmful thing I could do to try and get some money.
So Ted, it sounds like you've kind of put yourself on the line here.
Well, as I sort of hinted, over 15 years ago, I started the first dispensary in Canada, the Cannabis Buyers Club of Canada, and began helping people with chronic pain. I now have 3,600 members of our club. We have a facility on Johnson Street. We sell 32 edible and topical products that are alternatives to smoking cannabis. We've helped hundreds, if not well over 1,000 people, cut prescription drug use down dramatically by using this medicine edibly and topically. And it can't be underestimated how good it is for people as at times an alternative to smoking, or at least a complementary medicine to it. And so it's been a very interesting 15 years, to be sure. I've had a store for 10 years. We went through 4 police raids between 2002 and 2003, but we were acquitted of every charge against us, and in part because we are very careful and diligent to make sure we're only helping people in chronic pain, and in part because Health Canada's programs have been so fundamentally flawed that we are the only realistic alternative for most people. And so it's something that we actually had a bakery get raided a year and a half ago, though, and my friend Owen Smith has been charged with trafficking THC for making the cookies and the skin products of our club. So we have a 20-day jury trial coming up in January that will challenge the medical marijuana access regulations, and they should include THC, cannabis resin, CBD, CBN. Ironically, synthetic THC is available, $8 a pill, but it doesn't contain the muscle relaxants and other medical benefits that the whole plant medicine can.
Okay. Thanks for joining us. We're going to come back after a short break. You're watching Island Justice with Roger Batchelor.
You're watching an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.
Welcome back to Island Justice with Roger Batchelor, and today we're talking about the deregulation and regulation of marijuana. And again, we've got Don Mckay from Don Mckay Law Corporation and Ted Smith from International Hempology 101 Society. And just in the break, as a little aside, Don and I were talking about having practiced law about the same amount of time and come to Victoria about the same amount of time, and maybe you could just tell us a little bit about what you do in your practice.
Well, it's strictly a criminal defense practice. I do trial work as well as appellate work. I take any kind of case all the way from shoplifting to murder, so if you have trouble, I'm there for you. Okay.
And Ted, speaking about cases, what cases have you been involved in the courts yourself?
Okay, well, I was arrested in November 2000 for sharing joints at the University of Victoria at a 420. I was eventually convicted of trafficking in cannabis for that. I appealed unsuccessfully. I was also arrested 1 week later with 420 pot cookies at an annual pot cookie giveaway. I was eventually convicted by a jury for trafficking in THC for that. Mm-hmm. I was in 2 of the 4 police raids at the Cannabis Buyers Club I was arrested in as well. And so in one of those, I was charged with trafficking cannabis resin, as well as trafficking in cannabis, and was originally convicted of trafficking in resin, but in the appeal process, the Crown dropped the charges. So the 4 raids against the club, we successfully beat them one way or another. I've also had a half dozen, maybe 8 of the growers for the club arrested and charged over the years. I currently employ about 24 growers right now, mm-hmm. and one of my growers got busted this February, and so I have a couple of trials going on with growers. I've also come to know many individuals through court as well, and helped provide assistance in various ways at different stages with that, with people without lawyers in particular. Mm-hmm. And I also sat witness in the trial for the other Compassion Club in town, the Vancouver Island Compassion Club. They had a trial a few years ago that was about 50 days in court, and I saw about 46 of those days. Mm-hmm. And so I've probably bore witness to close to 100 days of various trials and tribulations in the courtroom, and yeah, studied a lot of case law. Mm-hmm.
And Don, a lot of people compare what's happening with marijuana now to prohibition of alcohol. What's your take on that?
My take is that I think that there ought to be decriminalization of all possession type charges. I see it as criminalizing the addicts primarily, and not that we're dealing with addicts in terms of this discussion, but it applies all the way through the process. When prohibition to alcohol came along, people still found ways to circumvent it. It created a lot more problems than it actually helped or cleaned up society, if you will. You end up in a situation where if people are addicted or people want a substance, they're going to get it, and the trouble that is created as a result of trying to enforce morality type laws is simply more than it's worth.
Mm-hmm. And what do you say about that in terms of prohibition? Do you see this as a form of prohibition? And who wins if they decriminalize it? It's not necessarily the people who get the marijuana who win.
Well, nothing personal, Don, but I sometimes jest that decriminalization is a lawyer's term for job protection. Because, as you said earlier, you're not dealing with possession charges right now anyway. We're dealing with trafficking charges and production charges. Yes. We need to legalize and regulate the use of cannabis, and gradually, I think, other drugs as well. The war on drugs has proven to be a failure on every level, and I think gradually we will learn to include drugs in the medical system and otherwise make them available under certain conditions, starting with cannabis. I know it's scary for people to think that drugs such as heroin and magic mushrooms and stuff would be legally available to adults, but I think ultimately that is by far the most reasonable measure to both control the quality of it on one hand for people that want to use these substances, but more importantly to take the economy that is the drug trade, which is one of the largest economies in the planet. Some estimate up to 8% of world trade is in illegal drugs. And so there's a lot of profit out of that 8% that gets reinvested back into the real world. Let's say 4% if half of the drug trade is profit at some level or not, gets reinvested back into small businesses in various ways, but sometimes not. And so that 92% of the real world each year gets infested in a way with drug money that needs to be hidden, and there's so much corruption at the highest levels of government in many places in this world that if the drugs were bought, sold, and made within the countries that the people were buying them from, for example, within the United States, they'd completely cut off the Mexican drug lords that are killing people rampantly in civil service, let alone in the rest of the communities, because they want those drug routes going up into the United States, and they'll do anything to keep them.
But Ted, I mean, I'd have to say that there is a slippery slope argument here, and maybe I'll ask Don to speak about this, because, I mean, as a lawyer myself in court, you see people who have addictions to drugs, and I'm not really referring to marijuana here, I'm talking about the more harder drugs, and what it does to them. And I think there's a responsibility at some level in society to address that, and I mean, I support your idea of regulating marijuana, but I think when you go beyond marijuana, I think it gets a little bit more complicated. What do you say to that, Don?
Well, I think that there's a lot of merit, though, to the idea that you can regulate the quality and the caliber of what is actually being sold and ingested. One of the things that plagues a lot of big city police departments, and I'm sort of speaking more generally as opposed to anything to do with Victoria, is that oftentimes bad product will hit the street where somebody has, for instance, in the case of heroin, perhaps cut it down using rat poison as opposed to powdered sugar. And it kills people. And that kind of quality control, I mean, if you want to put it in economic terms, would mean that the product could be made to be less threatening in that regard. Yes, you can argue that there's, sort of legalizing what is bad for people, but cigarettes and alcohol are bad for people, and in terms of the costs, of the medical cost to society of people who are addicted to those two drugs is substantial.
And throw in prescription drugs, like hillbilly heroin right now is a huge problem in a lot of places, and the abuse of prescription drugs and of alcohol have more people on the street mixing up, they're poly drug users. They'll use anything and everything, legal or not. They do not care. They just want to get as intoxicated and out of their own body as they possibly can, which is why it's important to legalize cannabis first, because it helps with that. But otherwise, really the percentage of people that use these drugs that end up on the street is quite small. I can assure you that for every person that you might see on the street using a drug like cocaine, there's 100 more that use it recreationally that got jobs in the provincial government and some very large establishments in town. A city like Toronto, for example, has hundreds of thousands of regular cocaine users. It might be once a weekend, it might be once a month, it might be once a year even. But it's something that can cause problems. But for the majority of people, and the majority of money going through that is not coming from people panhandling on the street. It's coming from working class citizens. And by regulating that and then treating the people that fall out of the system, that have health problems, as just that, people with healthcare problems, with mental addiction problems, get them in the healthcare system. Don't put them in and out of jails where they're costing, thousands of dollars, going in and out of emergency rooms because they can't even tell people what they're doing because they're so afraid of the law that they won't even, call someone if their friend's dying because they don't want the police to search the room, and they'll let their friend die instead.
Fair enough. So Don, going away from the topic for a second here, a question I always ask any lawyer on the show is to tell me about your most interesting case.
I don't know whether I'd call it my most interesting case, but it is certainly one that was gratifying. There was a fellow who was arrested after a spree of commercial break-ins. He had enormous drug debts that he was attempting to pay off by robbing a series of cash establishments. He was arrested and rearrested and held in jail, but what he was trying to do was to gather up enough money to pay off his drug debts so that he could go into rehab and be with his girlfriend who was pregnant, and they were going to have a baby together. Her family was supportive of him. His family was supportive. We worked with Judge Quantz, who is somebody who later on went to establish the integrated court system for dealing with people with severe addiction and mental health problems. This was prior to that. We worked with him and with Crown Counsel to get to the point where this fellow was given a break on a sentence for treatment purposes, and it was gratifying to receive the photograph of him and his wife and their baby, which was also shared with the judge as the upshot of all of this. It was a good success story for rehabilitation.
So we only have a couple minutes left, and Ted, I just wanted you to talk a little bit about the difference between the resins that you talked about earlier and what people would think of about being a joint.
Okay. Well, most people commonly associate cannabis, marijuana with the dried bud, but there are ways that you can make products out of it that are better for people. For example, hashish. It's made one way or another, essentially, to separate the leaf material from the resins and the oils on the plant. You can simply put it on a screen and the dried marijuana, the crystals will fall through the screen. Or you could use alcohol extracts is a very common method. But when you make hash, it's a lot smoother for people to smoke. You don't have all the tars and the chlorophyll and things that are in the raw plant. And so people can smoke less and have a greater medical benefit. But you can also cook the plant into butter or vegetable oils and extract it with a cheesecloth or something so that it's not as hard on the stomach, because the fiber is famous for being so strong, so it can really clean your stomach out if you eat it. So the butters and olive oil and grapeseed oils are ways that you can ingest it orally or topically, which are longer lasting and don't have any negative impacts upon the lungs for people that have sensitive lungs. And in some ways, the anti-inflammatory benefits in particular are much more activated when they're eaten orally than when smoked. The smoking of it is a quick shot of the medicine. But when you produce the resins, like the essential oils, a lot of the difference between strains is actually the oils. That's why they all smell so differently. And it's not as much the THC. The THC has some benefits, but the essential oils will often determine how someone will react to it, whether it helps them out with their nausea a lot, or with arthritic pain, or there's a wide range of symptoms that it benefits with, from muscle spasms to just people with MS controlling their bladder. It's quite neat.
Well, thank you very much, for both of you. And you've been watching Island Justice with Roger Batchelor, and today we've had Don Mckay from Don Mckay Law Corporation and Ted Smith from International Hempology 101 Society. Thanks for watching.
The proceeding was an independently produced community access program. The viewpoints expressed are those of the community access producer and do not reflect those of Shaw Cable Systems. The program is presented in response to CRTC policy guidelines regulating community programming.